Thank you, David. Like David said, and Lori, my name is Katie Miller. I'm with the Government Accountability Board. I'm an election specialist there. I'm going to talk right now the section about acceptable forms of photo identification. The first thing I want to reiterate is, like David said, there's no such thing as a voter ID card. We've been hearing of individuals going to the DMV saying that I need that voter ID card. There's no such thing as a voter ID card. What there are different forms of proof of identification or photo IDs that people already have, that already exist, that are approved for use when you go vote. So when you go to the polls on election day or you vote in person, you have to show what we're calling acceptable voter photo IDs. So there are specific types of identifications that are acceptable for voting purposes. We have a Wisconsin driver's license or Wisconsin state ID card, a U.S. passport, the book or the card, and a U.S. Uniform Service ID card. These 4 IDs can be expired on election day when you use them, as long as their expiration date was after the last general election. So, in 2012, you can use a driver's license or a state ID card that's been expired as long as it was expired after November 2nd, 2010. So if your ID expired January 13th, 2011, you can use it through 2012. If your ID expired June 1st, 2009, that expiration date is not valid. So it's since the last general election that these types of IDs can still be used even if they're expired. You can also use a driver's license or state ID receipt. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. A certificate of U.S. naturalization, a Native American tribal identification card, and a university or student ID card. It has to have specific requirements on it, but the card also has to come accompanied with a proof of enrollment, a document that has the student's name on it. It comes from the university, and it basically states that that student is enrolled in that current semester that the election is being held. So I'm going to get into those a little bit more specifically in just a minute. But if you'll notice, these identifications all include a photograph of the elector. On election day, your poll workers are going to look at that photograph, and when you vote in person in the clerk's office, they're going to look at that photograph, and that photograph has to reasonably resemble the person presenting the identification. So hopefully you have not changed so much from your ID card that you don't reasonably resemble yourself anymore, but your hair color may have changed. Maybe we lost some weight. That's what we're all hoping for, right? So as long as that photo reasonably resembles yourself, the bearer of the card, it's acceptable. The poll workers are also going to look at the elector's name. The name on the identification card has to conform to the name on the poll list or registration list. So if your name is Robert on your ID card, but it says Bob on the poll list, that's conforming. So they do not have to match exactly. And that's important because not everyone's name matches the way their identification card is, matches what's on the poll list. But it does have to conform. Also, your poll workers, the clerk, is going to look at the expiration date on the identification. That expiration date either has to be unexpired for those IDs that have to be valid on election day, or for those 4 IDs that can be expired, that the expiration date is since the last general election. The major point we want to make sure everyone knows, and we're spreading the word, is your address on the identification card does not have to match what is in that poll list. Proof of ID, proof of identification, is proving that you are who you say you are. Here's a picture of me and my name. There's my name in the poll list. It's not proving you live where you say you live. You do that during the registration process, and David's going to talk about that. But identification is your name, your photograph, and then the expiration date. And you're proving you are who you say you are. The address does not need to match. There are, before I talk about birth certificates, there are 2 types of identifications that are acceptable that don't actually have photos on them. If someone has their license revoked, the citation or the ticket that they received they can use that on election day at the polling place as their proof of identification. There's not going to be a photograph on that. In most cases, we've heard that police officers are not taking driver's license away from people at the time that they're getting a citation, but in some cases they are. So in the case that someone has their license physically taken from them at the time they receive a citation for drunk driving or something of that nature, they can use that citation on election day as their proof of identification. The other case are individuals who object to having their photograph taken for religious purposes. They can actually go to the DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles, and they can be issued a state identification card that is valid without photo. So that card can be used on election day even though there is not a photograph on it. And it does say valid without photo on it. We have a little slide here, and we also have a handout in your packet on page 11 about birth certificates. You do not need a birth certificate in order to vote. This is in your packet because a lot of the identifications that are acceptable on election day, in order to obtain them, one of the main documents most people need is a birth certificate. So in order to get a state ID card for someone who does not have a current photo ID, they will have to most likely get a birth certificate in order to get a state ID card. This sheet and everything in the packet we have made so that you can take out one of the pages and you can use that page to help people figure out how to get the identifications or how to get a birth certificate, photocopy it, and use it for your own purposes. But for the most part, you have to make sure you have a certified birth certificate, and the birth certificate has to come from the state in which you were born. So if you were not born in Wisconsin, you do have to go to the Vital Records office in the state in which you were born in order to obtain a birth certificate. And those prices can range between $10, $30, and the time it takes to get a birth certificate can range from 2 weeks to a couple of months. So we want to make sure people are getting those birth certificates early so that they can get them in time to get to the DMV and get a ID. But you have to make sure that it's certified. That's kind of the big part here. So if you or someone you know is thinking that they need to go to the DMV and to get a free state identification card, because the DMV is offering identification cards for free for voting purposes. I kind of have this little handout on page 13 and 14. I'm going to go through. The first thing you want to ask yourself is, do I need a state ID to vote? If you already have a Wisconsin driver's license, you're set. You don't have to go to the DMV. If you have a passport, you can use that. You don't have to go to the DMV. So ask yourself, am I already set for election day? Because if you already have a Wisconsin driver's license and you go to the DMV and you want to get a free state ID, they're going to ask you to surrender your driver's license. You cannot hold both a Wisconsin driver's license and a Wisconsin state ID card. You can only have one or the other. Also, if you are going to get a state ID and you're from out of state, you have to surrender your out-of-state driver's license, even if you're just getting a state ID card. So those people who are going to get their free state ID for voting purposes in Wisconsin but have an Illinois driver's license will have to surrender that Illinois driver's license before they can be issued a Wisconsin state ID card. So first ask yourself before you go to the DMV, do I need a state ID for voting purposes? Or do I have some other document that will work? If you have some other document, you're ready to go for election day. If you don't, the next thing you have to ask yourself is if you're qualified. Are you qualified to vote in Wisconsin? Are you at least 18 years old? Are you a U.S. citizen? Do you not have a driver's license? If you have a Wisconsin driver's license, then you don't qualify for a free state ID because you already have a driver's license. So if you say, yes, I qualify, I'm qualified to vote, I don't have any other documentation that I can use for voting purposes, the next question is, do I have the necessary documents? This is important. You don't want to go to the DMV and wait in line for 10 minutes. You don't want to wait in line and get to that counter and realize that you don't have what you need in order to get a free state ID. On page 14, it lays out there are 4 categories that you have to prove when getting a state identification card. You have to prove your name and date of birth, you have to prove your legal presence, your identity, and your Wisconsin residency. There's examples in each one of these categories on page 14 of documents that can prove these things. Now, for instance, your name and date of birth and your legal presence can both be proven by your birth certificate. So one document can actually cover 2 categories. But your identity has to be proven through a certificate of marriage, your social security card, something of that nature, and your Wisconsin residence has to be proven through a pay stub or a utility bill. So there are documents here that you can use, examples of them that you can use at the DMV to receive your state ID card. There is a little bit of a confusion on that black kind of line underneath the 4 different categories. It says you do not have to show your social security card, but you must provide the number. I just want to clarify that. When you fill out the application for a free state ID, you have to provide your social security number. You don't have to show your card when you're filling out the application. But if you're using your social security card to prove your identity, and that's one of the 4 things you need to prove, you actually have to have the card. So if you're using your social security card to prove your identity, you have to physically have the card. If you're using your certificate of marriage to prove your identity, then you don't need your card, you just have to provide the social security number on the form. So the application form for a free state ID is always going to ask for your social security number. You don't need the card when you're filling out the form, but if you're using your social security card to prove your identity, you do need the actual card. The last thing you have to make sure you do when you're at the DMV getting your free state ID card is you have to ask for a free state ID or let the customer service representative know that you are getting a state ID for voting purposes and that you need it for free. There is a box that you need to check on the application. Right now, the application for a state ID and the application for a driver's license are the same application. The DMV is separating those out right now. We don't have examples of that yet. So in our example up above, make sure you check you're asking for a free state ID, that you're applying for an identification card, and then make sure you check the box that says you need this identification card for free for voting purposes. The customer service representative is not going to ask you if you would like a free ID. You have to be proactive and you have to be the one to ask and tell that representative that you need an ID for free for voting purposes. So we have examples in our packet of all of the different types of identifications that are acceptable for voting purposes. We have driver's license and state ID cards. Those are on page 15 and 17. And each of these, like I said, on the back of the driver's license, it also tells you the documents you're going to need in order to get a driver's license. So each one of these pages includes information on the type of identification. So you can use your Wisconsin driver's license or your Wisconsin state ID card. Another common misunderstanding about the law is that you could use an out-of-state driver's license. You cannot. It has to be a Wisconsin driver's license or Wisconsin issued state ID card. Now, I said I was going to talk about these driver's license receipts, and those are on page 19. Let's take a look at them. Most DMVs are not issuing your driver's license card or that state identification card at the actual center anymore. What they're doing is you apply, you fill out the paperwork, you're going to get a receipt for your driver's license or state ID, and then they are going to mail you your actual card in about 2 weeks. So for about 2 weeks, you are driving around or you're existing with a state ID or driver's license, but you don't have the actual card. Instead, you get to use this piece of paper or document that has all of the same information on it as your driver's license or state ID would. And they're called DMV receipt, state ID receipt, or driver's license receipt. So that document is acceptable for voting purposes at the polling place or in the clerk's office. Now, it should be valid for 45 days. That's the period of time that receipt's good for, is 45 days. As long as it's used within that period, you can use it for voting purposes. And once you get your card, you'll get to use that. Like I said, there's the state ID without photo for those individuals who do not have their photo taken or object to having their photo taken for religious purposes. And you can use your U.S. book or card. There's a passport book or card now that you can use for voting purposes. And these IDs can be expired on Election Day, but only since the last general election. We have our Uniform Services ID card. Got an example of what that looks like on page 25. Now, the law specifically says U.S. Uniform Service ID. There are 7 U.S. Uniform Services that are specifically listed. So if your National Guard falls under either Army or Air Force or Navy, so National Guard does apply. And they're listed here: Coast Guard, Public Health Services, Navy, Army, Marine Corps, Air Force, National, I always say, Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And then the, thank you, I mispronounce atmospheric pretty often. And the spouses and dependents of those individuals will also have their own individual military ID card, and those can be used for voting purposes also. Unfortunately, while the law specifically states U.S. Uniform Services, so there are some other military IDs that are not acceptable, such as Military Veteran Affairs IDs that are issued by Veterans Affairs. Those are not acceptable for voting purposes. We do receive that question a lot. It's not one of the 7 U.S. Uniform Services. It's not an acceptable form of photo ID. There's a certificate of naturalization that can be used. Note, there is also a certificate of citizenship that looks almost exactly the same as a certificate of naturalization, but the certificate of citizenship is not acceptable for voting purposes, just the certificate of naturalization. And it can only be used if it's not issued no earlier than 2 years before the date of the election. So the certificate of naturalization has to only be issued 2 years before that election. So in that case, that individual would have to get another form of ID after that 2-year period expires. There's also tribal ID cards from federally recognized Native American tribes in Wisconsin. There's a list of those on page 29. From talking with different tribes, we found out that the enrollment process in order to get an ID can be anywhere from 2 months to a year. So those individuals who qualify as a member of a federally recognized Wisconsin Native American tribe do want to get moving on getting an identification card from their tribe, because that enrollment process can vary. And then there are the university or college student IDs. Right now, technical colleges are included along with universities and colleges, other colleges, as of right now. We'll see if they weren't, and now they are, and they maybe won't be again, but we'll see. Stay tuned, is what I always like to say. So basically, what the college IDs have to have a picture of the student, like all the others, the name of the student. They also have to have a date of issuance on the card and an expiration date that's no greater than 2 years past the issuance date. And they also have to include the signature of the student. So that's the identification card. But then in order to use it for voting purposes, the card also has to be accompanied by a proof of enrollment, which is a document that you can tell is issued from the school or came from the university or college, that has the elector's name on it and indicates that they are enrolled in that college for that semester. So examples, and it's not limited to, but some examples are a class schedule or a fee, like a tuition payment, that they paid their tuition for that semester, something issued from the university. I know some universities are talking about sending a letter to their college students with the student's name on it and their address, and that they are registered, that they are enrolled from date A to date B. So that information might be available, and those are things that college students can use to prove their enrollment. So that's for proof of identification. Now, for proof of residence for college students, a college student, when they prove their residence, which is when they're registering to vote, and oftentimes, most of us usually are registered to vote for quite a while at a location. We're pretty stable. You move into a place and you want to stay there for a while. A lot of times with college students, they're moving year to year. So before elections, they usually have, a lot of times, we see a high rate of re-registration, where college students have to register before most elections. When you register on election day and during late registration period in the clerk's office, you have to show a proof of residence when you're registering. This is my form with my information and my address. This is a proof of registration showing that I live at this address. College students can use their college ID coupled with a fee receipt payment dated no earlier than 9 months before the election to prove their residency. They can also use their college ID with a housing list provided by the university. The housing list has to come from the university. It's provided to the municipal clerk. It has the student's name and address and an indication of the citizenship of the student. That list, coupled with the identification card, can be used for proof of residence. David is going to get into residence and proof of residence and registration, in which he's going to talk about college students are not wedded to just using their student identification card, though, as a proof of residence. They can also use any of the other acceptable forms of proof of residence, which I'll let David get into. But are there any questions on different types of photo identifications and what's required through photo ID on election day for voting purposes or in the clerk's office when voting absentee?
Thank you, because I'm going to be registering and having people vote that reside in nursing homes. Can you elaborate on what they might need? I hear there's some exemptions for nursing homes.
There are, and I'm going to talk about that when we talk about absentee voting, because in nursing homes, they exclusively can vote absentee in nursing homes through special voting deputies, which is what you do. So I will talk about that when I talk about absentee.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I was curious how the DMV was working with people who come in for their ID, and so went out there, and on the front door, and several places inside, they have a poster that says you can get a free ID for voting purposes, and just be sure to check the box. And then you look at the application, and there are several boxes. Only one of them talks about this. So there's a poster in the back that shows which of the boxes is the one. But I understand with the division now between the driver's license and ID applications that that's going to be irrelevant come December or something. So, but you might, it seems like the thing that is important to encourage anybody who's going to go and ask for that to make sure that they know where the box is that they need to check. I asked her what happened, the supervisor, what happens if somebody comes up to the window and says, I want this free ID, and the person working sees they haven't checked it, and she said they will be told to take it back and read the application carefully. So that's why they need to know where to look.
Mm-hmm. And with the division of forms between a driver's license and the identification card, there's still a box they're going to have to check. So it's not going to be more descriptive. It's going to say check a box to get your free state ID, and the applicant is responsible for finding which box is appropriate for them to check. Go ahead.
All right. Yes, I work with the functionally illiterate adults. Is there going to be anyone that can assist them as far as they can't read? So check this box, check that box, it really means nothing to them. So will they be able to get assistance at the desk, or can they bring a representative with them, or how does that work?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how DMV's assistance works. I know for voting purposes, you can have someone assist you filling out your registration forms, or someone can mark the ballot on your behalf. If you would like someone to read the ballot to you, they can mark it on your behalf. But at the DMV, I'm not sure. I would definitely go up to the customer service section at the DMV and let them know that this person is announce yourself as being illiterate, and they should be able to provide you some assistance.